Hello everyone and welcome to module 7 of the course. Today we're going to be talking about honouring the gods. Okay, so in this module we're going to talk about who are the gods and talk a little bit about the theology behind how we see the gods. We're going to give some examples of gods, and then we're going to look in detail at some of the main gods, okay, like Thor and Freyr and Odin and so on. Then we're going to go on to talking about activities to connect with the gods, particularly 6 ways of being religious, and then some important tips to finish things off. Okay, so who are the gods? What are they like? What do we see in the lore about them? Okay, so the first thing to be aware of is they're not really gods of something. So if you think like when we talk about like the Roman, the Greek gods, it's like the god of war or the god of thunder and lightning or the god of love or whatever. Okay, you don't really see that in heathenry. Okay, rather they are like us, like human beings, with personalities, with goals, and with many interests and abilities. Okay, so they won't just be a god of something, but they will have many things that they have power and ability to do. Okay, they're not just nature personified either. Some people nowadays like to call them that, and that's a way of seeing them if you want to. You can see them that way, but they don't really fit with that idea. So they're not just nature personified when you look at the lore. Okay. So Ben Wagner, he says, many of our gods have multiple names expressing different facets of their beings. Okay, they have lots of different facets. They're not just one interest or one thing. Okay, they're not always good. Okay, this is important. They are not like the Christian God who is omnibenevolent, so always good and perfect. So they say. The gods that we worship, they're not. If you look at the text and the lore, you'll see them doing things that are sometimes quite morally dubious. Okay, they are also limited. Okay, and they are just as subject to fate as we are. Okay, it says the gods are basically under the control of fate. They live, they die just as the fates will decree. Okay, especially when you get to Ragnarok, a lot of the gods die at that point. So they're just as subject to fate as we are. They are limited. Okay, they are not like the Christian God, as I said. They're not all powerful. They're not omniscient, all knowing. They're not omnibenevolent, all good. They're not omnipresent everywhere at once. Okay, they are limited in time and space beings. Okay, now when you think about the whether it's the Norse or the Greek or the Roman or anything, you often think about a pantheon of gods where there's multiple gods that are all in one sort of big family or group. Okay, there doesn't seem to have actually been a consistent pantheon when we look at a lot of the evidence in the lore. The only place we see that is in the Prose Edda, where Snorri, who's a Christian who likes to systematize things, he systematizes it into one big pantheon. Okay, but that probably was not the way it was seen earlier on. Okay, before he got his hands on it. There were undoubtedly, though, gods that were common in many areas. Thor, Odin, Frigg, Tyr, Freyr, they're seen across a lot of different communities and a lot of different areas. But as for many of the other gods, you might find them more in one place than another. And even these gods, you'll find that they're particularly popular in certain countries and not in others. Okay, so for instance, Thor, particularly in, well, in fact, Thor probably across the whole lot, but Tyr, particularly in Denmark, Freyr, particularly in Sweden, and Thor and Freyr, particularly in Iceland. So the only time we really see a big pantheon is in community celebrations, communities for the or celebrations for the whole community, where lots of different peoples and groups are coming together. Okay, for instance, you've got the Uppsala temple, and there's a account by Adam of Bremen where it talks about there being the 3 main gods of Thor, Odin, and Frey at 3 statues, basically, at this community celebration in Uppsala, in the temple there. That doesn't mean that every temple everywhere had those 3 statues, or that those were the only statues, or only gods, or anything. Okay, that is just that seems to have been the key ones for that large community celebration. Okay. And also you've got the sun balls, which are like a community ritual drinking. Often there you'll see 3 or 4 different gods being honoured, particularly Odin and Freyr and Njord, Thor. So sometimes you also see the pantheons there, okay, or a pantheon. It's likely that particular tribes emphasize the worship of only actually a few particular gods. Okay, so you'll have a couple of gods of your tribe, most likely. You wouldn't have like 15 different gods that were being worshipped. You'll have 1 or 2 maybe in that tribe. Okay, and Thomas Dubois, he said, he writes, there's intercult rivalry between Odin, Thor, Freyr, Njord, and God, that's the Christian God, appears strong during the Viking Age, and it appears that different individuals or communities found different gods of appeal over time, depending on cultural, regional, economic, familial, or occupational factors. Okay, so he's saying that there's different cults to different gods, and there's rivalry between them, and different peoples or communities will focus on particular gods at particular times, okay, in particular areas. You probably had a god of your family or a god of your community that was honoured. Likewise, you don't need to worship them all, okay? So you don't need to worship every single god. You can choose 1 or 2 that you feel closest to. They may decide that you're not for them, and they may actually point you to another god or hand you over to another god. But to get started, you can choose a couple of gods or a god to worship and honour, okay? The ones that sort of really call out to you. That said, you don't need to have a patron god, like a really special patron relationship with a god, okay? You can just have a general devotional worship to that god. There are examples, though, of something similar called a fulltree, which means encompassing dedication, okay? And some people refer to this in the lore, and they could be called that, or they could be called, another term is a friend of Thor, or a friend of Freyr, okay? And this is for people who have particularly close relationships with or devotion to them. So honouring the gods, you could just have standard honouring the gods whenever you need to, but there's ones that are particularly devoted to those gods with a close relationship. They might be called a friend of that god, okay, or a fulltree. So a particular god may approach you as well. So you could choose a particular god to worship, or they may actually approach you, maybe through dreams or through events that happen in your life. As I said, you can approach the ones you feel most affinity for, but they may pass you on to other gods, okay? So be aware of that. The gods also can include other tribes. So we've got the Vanir tribe, which is different from the Æsir tribe. So Thor and Odin and Frigg and Tyr seem to be more of the Æsir, whereas the Vanir are gods like Freyr and Freya and Njord and Nerthus, and so on. You've got the Jotnar, which are giants, which again are another tribe, and some people do worship them. I think it's questionable whether you should do that, but it's up to you, basically, on that one. And you often find that they do intermarry. In fact, there are Jotnar that you could worship. For instance, Freyr marries Gurth, and Njord marries Skadi, and they're seen as gods, but they actually come from the Jotnar. And the gods themselves, as we saw in the cosmology module, are descended from the Jotnar as well, giants. So you can worship other ones as well, okay? And although many of the Germanic cultures share the same gods, usually with slightly different names, the way they were seen was often quite different. So Odin, for instance, in the Norse and the Icelandic, becomes much more of a war god, whereas in the Anglo-Saxon, he seems to be more of a shamanic, magical god, okay? And probably in the continental German, if you go back far enough, definitely more of the sort of shamanic death, psychopomp type god. Okay, so they change how they're seen over time. They change with the different cultures. Okay, so that was what the gods are, or who the gods are. Now, I've got a list here of all the Norse gods, or many of the Norse gods, and many of the Anglo-Saxon gods. And as you can see, there's a massive list, okay? There are even others as well, okay? But you don't need to worship all of these, okay? You can choose a couple to worship, all right? But this gives you like a broad idea of all of them, or a lot of them. And some of them are like similar. So Odin and Woden are just the same being, basically. Thor and Thunor, Tyr and Tiw, Frigga and Freya, Sunna, Mani, Mona, and Freyr and Ingwe, and Jord and Nerthus. Okay, so some of them are the same, but some of them are very different. So the Anglo-Saxons, for instance, had gods like Eostra, and Wada, and Hengist and Horsa, whereas the Norse have Loki or Heimdall, okay, or Skadi. These are unique to their particular countries, okay, their particular areas and tribes and things. Okay, so let's get into actually talking about the gods and goddesses. And I'm going to focus on 8 of the main ones, 8 of the probably the most popular. Now, the one goddess I'm not going to talk about on here, who is very popular, is Hel. Okay, because she comes into the Jotnar term, and whether she is one to worship, I don't know. That's for you to decide. But these are ones that undoubtedly are gods that you could worship. Okay, Thor, Odin, Frigg, Tyr, Freyr, Freya, Jord or Nerthus, and Eostra. But like I said, there are many others. Okay, you don't have to use these ones. You can look in the lore. There's a brilliant book, the 2021 version of Artroth Volume 2, which is all about the gods and goddesses. It's got loads of information in that, which you can use to look up whichever gods you're interested in, and find out all about them. Okay. What I would say if you're a beginner is that you start with Thor, or Thunor if you're an Anglo-Saxon. I'd say he's probably the easiest god for beginners to connect to. He's called a friend of mankind and a protector of Middle Earth. He's a really, really sort of personable one, okay, to try and connect to. But you can choose others as well, that's fine. Now, scholars such as Terry Gunnell point out that the evidence suggests that different individuals and families worshipped different gods, okay, rather than being an overall pantheon. So you don't have to worship every single god. You just can choose a few and make them your household gods, your family gods, okay? The Lord doesn't show people also calling on different gods for different things, but rather than calling on the same god for many things, okay? So they didn't call on, I don't know, Air as a goddess of healing, for healing, and Thor for protection, and Odin for war, necessarily. They would have called on Odin for all of those things, and Thor for all of those things, okay? They would have called on the same god or goddess for most of their needs, okay? Or the same couple of goddesses and gods. So as we go through these, we're going to go through them in quite a lot of detail. Notice the similarities as well as the differences between these gods. One of the things I'm trying to portray here is that the same god is being called on for many different things that you would think another god would have normally been called on. Okay, but actually that's not the case. Okay, it depends who you've got the relationship with, because the gods are not a piggy bank in the sky, as I said before. Okay, they are a being with their own ideas and agendas and personalities and goals and everything. And just like you wouldn't go up to a stranger in the street and just randomly ask them to do something for you, okay, you would go to someone you have a relationship with and ask them to help you with something. And that's the same thing here. And you're not going to be able to maintain 15, 20 relationships with different gods, okay? Choose a few, build that relationship with those ones, okay? And then ask them for all the needs that you have, okay? So let's get started then with Thor, or Thunor. So he was the most popular deity in heathen times, okay? He's seen across all the different countries. He's seen across all the different time periods. He's the most talked about in the lore, most place names, all that sort of stuff. Okay, he seems to be the most popular deity of all, and possibly he was even potentially one of like the chief deity at one point. Okay, so some scholars suggest that he was the main all-purpose god and was probably, as I said, even chief god for many people. Okay, so they wouldn't have had this pantheon with Odin always being at the top god. Okay, different tribes might have had different layerings of where different gods fitted in, and usually there would have not been lots of gods, maybe just a few. Okay, none of the evidence suggests that he was a lesser or underling god compared to Odin. Okay, apart from possibly Snorri, who puts him down as a son of Odin and so therefore lesser, but actually none of the other evidence suggests that. Okay, place names show he was worshipped almost everywhere in Scandinavia, in England, and on the continent. Okay, so he's everywhere. And the Irish even calls the Vikings of Dublin the people of Thor. So clearly the Irish Celtic peoples thought that Thor was the main god of the Vikings, okay, at least the ones that went to Dublin. Thor was very common. It was also a very common name in Iceland. Okay, so a quarter of the original settlers' names were based on Thor in some way. Okay, and he seems to be the most important god in Iceland and one of the most important everywhere. So in Tacitus, it talks about a god who, well, there's a few things here. So firstly, it talks about they worship Mercury. Actually, this might be Julius Caesar. They worship Mercury, chief of all. Okay, and Mercury is actually Woden or Odin. Okay, but other places in Tacitus, it talks about particularly how their main gods, okay, include there's three. So Mars, Hercules, and Mercury. And Mars is two. Mercury, as I said, is Woden or Odin, and Hercules would be Thor. Okay. Then you've got Admiral Bremen, and he talks about, again, at this Uppsala temple, that there are three statues. You've got Odin, Thor, and Frigg. Freyr. But the one in the center, the one that's highest up in the center, that's Thor. Okay. And then you've got the baptismal vow. And the baptismal vow, which talks about basically when Charlemagne went in to Saxony and was converting Saxons, he forced them to take this vow when they get baptized. And that vow said that they have to give up worshipping the devils of Thor, Woden, and Sexnat. Okay. So again, we've got Thor here. So you can see he's one of the most important gods, if not the most important, in a lot of places. He's the son of Odin and Fjorgyn, or Jord, okay, which means earth. So he's called the son of earth, okay. That said, though, the prologue to the Prose Edda says that Thor comes before Odin, okay. Now, this is obviously something Snorri has written and made up. So, but maybe there was at that time some sort of idea going round that Thor was actually the father, in some tribes, that Thor was actually the father of Odin or was prior to Odin in some way. But the traditional idea is that he is the son of Odin and the earth, basically. He's married to Sif, who was probably an agricultural goddess, and he also has a concubine called Jarnsaxa. He has some sons called Magni, which means strength, Mothi, which means bravery, and a daughter called Thrud, who is also a Valkyrie, and again, it means strength. So you can see it emphasizes his attributes there. He's the strongest of the gods, okay? In fact, he's so strong that he can't really cross the Bifrost Rainbow Bridge. He has to walk or use a chariot, and he's often called Oku Thor, which means Thor the charioteer. Okay, so and you can see a picture in the bottom right there of him riding a chariot, and that's being pulled by two goats. Okay. He's often said to have a red beard and blazing red eyes, and he's referred to in the lore as Red Thor. okay, because of this, probably because of his beard being red. He has a hall called Bildskirnir, and he's very fond of eating and drinking, sort of a parties type guy. And he's called the friend of mankind, or the common man's patron. Okay, so he's one that the common men, the common people, the farmers, etc., they would worship in particular. So that's one of the reasons he's really quite a good one to honor as well. If you're trying to sort of get to know one of the gods to start with, very approachable, and he is very direct though in dealing with issues. Okay. Now Thursday is a holy day to him because Thurs goes from Thor, which is, so it's Thor's day basically. So if you want to honor him, Thursday is a really good day to honor him. Okay. And he's also seems to be quite morally upright compared to gods like Odin. So you don't really find Thor doing things that are morally dubious, whereas you do with a lot of the other gods, especially Odin. So if you want one that's sort of a really moral god, then Thor will fit that. So firstly, he seems to be a sky god, okay, because of his association with the weather, with storms and that sort of thing. And we talked about the Indo-Europeans back in the first module and how they had a sky father. Their chief of their pantheon was the sky father. Okay, and Thor shares many of these attributes of the Indo-European sky father. Okay, his name is not etymologically linked to that sky father. That would be the closest there, but he still has many of the attributes of it. Okay, so H.R. Ellis Davison, the scholar, she says, he was the god supreme, not only over the stormy sky, but also over the life of the community in all its aspects. If part of the mantle of the old sky god, Tiwaz, fell upon Odin, a great part of it undoubtedly covered the broad shoulders of Thor. In other words, there may have originally been Tu or Tiwaz as the head god, and then his role got usurped by partly Odin and partly Thor. Okay, these attributes come to them. However, it's important to note that Thor was a god that goes back way into like the Bronze Age and earlier. Okay, so the idea of this sky god with a hammer or an axe is found probably before the Indo-Europeans even get into Scandinavia. Okay. Thor and Thunor itself means thunder. Okay, so he's the storm god, the sky god who controls the storms and the thunder and the lightning and stuff. In Old English, there's a term high thunderer, which is used for the Christian god, but it's probably a memory of Thor. Okay, so they talk about Christian god as the high thunderer, but that probably is because they've replaced Thor with the Christian god, and they're just using some of the old terms for Thor. He's equated, as I said, by the Romans with Hercules and also with Jupiter or Jove. Now, Jupiter or Jove was the supreme god in the Greco-Roman state pantheon, basically. So the Greco-Romans did have a pantheon, particularly at a state level, at a high level, and their supreme god of that was Jupiter. But also Hercules, he's got lots of similarities to Hercules with his sort of club and his fighting and all that sort of stuff. He's a god who controls storms, thunder, lightning, and weather. So again, that associates him with the sky. His statue is, I should have said also, Jupiter and Jove is a god of the light of lightning and of the sky, and he's the sky father of the Romans. His statue is mentioned in temples much more than others, okay? And where he shares the temple with others, his statue occupies the place of honor. So like I said with Adam of Bremen, his statue was the one in the middle, the one highest up, okay? So he's sort of seen as a more supreme there. Elfric was an Anglo-Saxon in 955 to 1012 CE, says, this Jove, so Jove, Jupiter, Thor basically, is the most venerable of all the gods whom the heathens had in their heresy. And among some nations he is called Thor, whom the Danish people love most. Now, this is interesting. It says the Danish people love Thor most. Place names, though, would suggest that Tu was the chief or the most popular god in Denmark, but certainly this text is saying that Thor, and maybe the Danish here isn't just Denmark, it probably covers a whole area, Sweden and Norway and stuff as well. And they're saying Thor is the ones they love the most. Okay, the god they love the most. Flateyar book says Thor sat in the middle. He was the most highly honored. Heimskringla says Thor, as the most considered among the gods, sat there adorned with gold and silver. So this is talking about statues, basically, to Thor. In Ulfjordslag, oaths are sworn to 3 gods: Freyr, Njord, and the Almighty God, which scholars say is probably Thor. Okay. And Thomas Dubois says, textual and place name evidence indicates that Thor may have enjoyed a favoured status among Germanic peoples before the rise of Odin. And place name and personal naming practices in Iceland, as well as the other Atlantic settlements, clearly indicate the dominance of Thor worship in the region. Okay. Now, he's also a protector. So he is the strongest of the gods. He protects Asgard from the giants, basically, and he fights against all these forces of chaos. So whether that's the giants or whether that's his arch enemy, Jormungandr, who's the world serpent. So that's a lot of the myths are about how he's protecting Asgard. Okay. He's often called on by sailors and travelers for protection, especially at sea. And even Christians can call on him, like Helgi the Lean does in the lore. Okay. He travels lots himself. He guides travelers to new land. So in Landnámabók, when they go to Iceland and they want to know, there's a priest basically of Thor who wants to know where to land and where to build his temple. So he brings these high seat pillars from a temple in Norway, throws them into the sea near Iceland, and says wherever they land, that's where he's going to build the temple. So he basically is asking Thor to show him where to build this temple, and that's what he does. It's good to call on Thor for strength. Okay, he's also called Midgard's Vrjandi, the protector of Earth. Okay, so this is particularly nowadays when we're talking about environmentalism and the need to protect the nature and the Earth. The Earth is his mother. Okay, so he's obviously going to be very protective of her. And so he's a good one to call on when you're doing environmental stuff, environmental work. Okay, he's a warrior. Okay, he's called Hercules by some of the Roman sources, which is very much a fighter in the Roman myths, but it's normally a defensive role in myths. Okay, as I said, in the modern times he's a defender of Earth, his mother. He's a special item, which is his hammer, which may originally have been an axe or a club. If you go back far enough into like the images we have of the prehistoric time or the Neolithic times, he seems to have an axe or a club. But he also has this belt of strength too, okay, which helps him. And he seems to also have been the principal god that was called on by heathens against the new Christian god. Okay, so when Christians were coming into there and taking over Scandinavia, the heathens were calling on Thor principally, and then they wear the Thor's necklace at that point to sort of protect them against the Christian influence. But he's not just a protector and a sky god, he's also a healer. Okay, so we've got some charms like the Canterbury charm and a rune amulet from Sodruk and Vinnaby, where he's specifically called on to destroy disease-causing agents. So that's the way he heals, in that he basically goes into wherever there's a disease-causing thing and fights against those things and destroys them. That's his sort of protective but healing role at the same time. So he protects us from illness. He also has this hammer, Mjolnir, but that's used to bring back things to life. So there's a tale where he kills his goats and eats them, but keeps the bones. And then the next day he uses the hammer to touch them and it brings them back to life. So he has the power not only to protect and kill, but also to heal and bring back to life. Okay. He is a hallower. Okay. So H.R. Ellis Davison says, the power of the thunder god, symbolized by his hammer, extended over all that had to do with the well-being of the community. It covered birth, marriage, and death, burial and cremation ceremonies, weapons and feasting, travelling, land taking, and the making of oaths between men. The famous weapon of Thor was not only the symbol of the destructive power of the storm and of the fire from heaven, but also a protection against the forces of evil and violence. Okay, so the hammer was used for many, many things. Okay, as a hallowing object, as a blessing object. Okay, so you would hallow the bride. You put the hammer in the bride's lap. Okay, in a marriage. Okay, to bless her and hallow her. You'd hallow the Ve, the sacred space, with a hammer. You could hallow the runes. Okay, you could hallow the funeral pyre. Well, they did hallow the funeral pyre of Balder. He goes up and he sort of raises it over the funeral pyre of Balder in the myths and hallows it. It could be used to hallow the newborn child in the myths, and it hallows goats to restore them to life. Okay, so it brings them back to life, like I said, when they died. So it's used in all these ways in the lore. Okay, and so it's a really important object in our rituals, but it also shows Thor's role as something that hallows and blesses when it comes to community events. Okay. Saxo talks about the hammer being used in ritual to imitate the noise of thunder. Okay, so maybe when you're doing a ritual, you could bang it at the beginning to illustrate the noise of thunder. Okay. On cremation urns, it often has his hammer, or it has a swastika symbol, which is said to be 4 Thor's hammers, all basically go around in a circle. So again, it's linked with this community situation of cremation and death. So it protects the community and it blesses the people at key rites of passage in life and in rituals. Okay. He is also an oath keeper. Okay, his temples have oath rings in them often. Okay, and Irish sources, mentioned a ring of Thor that's taken from his temple. Okay, so he's very much associated not only with hallowing at like births and marriages and deaths and stuff, but also overseeing oaths. Okay, oaths are very important to him. Okay, and more. So there's more that he's associated with. So he's a provider as well. So Adam of Bremen says, they say he rules the air, which controls the thunder and lightning, the winds and showers, the fair weather, and the fruits of the earth. Okay, so he is not just a god of the thunder and lightning and storms, but also the rain and the fair weather as well, and the fruits of the earth. Okay, so the harvest. He's a harvest god, a provider, a fertility. His name is linked to some agricultural sites as well, various fields of Thor and things like that. They believe that lightning and rains were what made the crops grow. So particularly like the summer storms, or the storms just before summer, were thought to be good because they helped to ripen the crops. So he is the one who ripens the crops that way. In southern Sweden, he is called the good peasant, or the good fellow of wheat or of the fields. Okay, so again, he's associated with the farmers and the farming and fertility and provision of food. And in fact, he's the patron of the common man or of the farmers. Okay, Bornholm, it says 3 furrows in Thor give a green spring. Okay. He has 2 goats as well, and those goats are also something that is an image of farming and links him basically to farmers. And it's not just farming; it's also fishing that he's linked with. Okay, because there's a story of where he goes out fishing to try and catch the Jormungandr world serpent. Okay, so he's associated with fishing as well, and sailors call on him for safe travel when they're on the sea and things like that. So he's associated with lots of different things as a provider. Okay, so a protector, a sky god, a healer, an oath protector, a hallower, a provider. And also something you don't often see about him is that he's actually also associated with magic. He's a magician. So, for instance, there's I think it's runestone that says Thor, make Seidr. Okay, now Seidr is that Norse magical practice, sort of a shamanic type practice where it's normally associated for women. The women do it. It's something that Odin learns from Freya. But here we're having Thor being called on to do this. So evidently Thor seems to have been believed that Thor could do this as well and had learned this. He does a lot of sort of shamanic actions. So he travels different worlds to fight enemies and find lost objects. He gets his staff from Grid, okay? And the staff is a sort of shamanic object. He dresses sometimes in female garb. So these are all sort of shamanic-y type things. There's a story of Thorhaller, okay? So they go to this Thorhaller and some other Christians, and they're on a boat, and they go to this land. I think it's Iceland, actually. And there is, they're getting hungry. There's no food around. So Thor does this special ritual, Thorhaller, sorry, does a special ritual calling on Thor. It's like a shamanic Sather type ritual. And this whale beaches themselves basically on the beach, and then they have something to eat. But while Thorhaller is okay eating it, the Christians get sick from eating it, okay, which shows how it's been brought by Thor, because he calls on Thor, and Thor basically provides him with this food. He is often called on to hallow the runes. In fact, the Odin is not really mentioned on runestones at all, even though we associate him with runes. It's Thor that's always mentioned on the runestones. Usually it says something like, Thor, hallow these runes, okay, or something like that. And he's also called on in later Christian times, so now we're getting to sort of the 15th, 16th centuries, in magic spells alongside other gods. Okay, so it's not just back in heathen times. He survives as a being that's called on in magic right up sort of 15, 16, 1700s, that sort of time frame. Okay, so he definitely also associated with magic. Okay, so let's talk about a little bit about some aspects of his worship. Okay, firstly, oaks. Oaks are a sacred tree to Thor. Okay, they're struck by lightning more often than any other trees, and that's probably where the association comes from. There's lots of talk about oaks of Thor or groves of Thor. So you've got Torseka, where there's a Thor's oak grove, and St. Boniface is said to have cut down an oak of Jupiter. Jupiter is essentially Thor. He seems to have been primarily worshipped in sacred groves and meadows in the earlier period, okay? But obviously, as we get later, we know that worship moves into temples and halls, and so he's worshipped in temples in later sources. Poles seem to be an important part of his worship. So there's Thirstable in Essex, okay, a place in Essex in England, and it's called Thirstable, which means Thunor's post. Or there's also Barstable, which means post of the bearded one, and the post is, or the bearded one, sorry, is Thor here. So these poles, they seem to be like high seat pillars, okay, like a world tree, for instance. They're the pillar that supports and upholds the house and protects it from lightning. Okay, so there is a pillar in people's centrally in people's houses in the past, which to basically kept the roof up, and it is said to have protected the house from lightning. But it can also be used to mark sacred space. Okay. Now, there are god nails. Okay, these are things that are like a nail traditionally stuck into a god post, and it's used for striking holy fire. Okay, to start your candle, your fire for a ritual. There's a story where Thor throws Hrungnir's, he fights Hrungnir, who's a giant basically, and he throws this Hrungnir throws this whetstone at Thor. Okay, and it gets stuck in part of his head, and that may be the origin of this idea of these god names. Okay, we don't know for sure, but it's a theory. He's very associated with fire. Okay, so we said about this god nails already. In Kajalnasinga saga, it talks about a sacred fire that never goes out in Thor's temple. Lightning itself is seen as the fire from heaven. If we look at the culture next to the Scandinavians, the Sami, they have an image of the thunder god which has a nail in it for striking fire from. So this again is where these god nails might come from. And you've got the Prussian thunder god, Perkunos, okay, which does have a link back to the Indo-European thunder gods. Perkunos, he has a grove with sacred fire that must be kept burning. Okay, so there's a similarity between these, it's continental and Norse, and the Prussians. Okay, so there's a lot of crossover there. So he's associated with fire, associated with poles, associated with oaks. In folklore, particularly in Scandinavia, Thor month March is considered Thor month. Okay, so that's a particularly good time to honor Thor. Okay, and you've got the first 3 Thursdays in March are the Thursdays of Thor. July the 29th is St. Olaf's Day, and it's said that St. Olaf has taken on a lot of Thor's attributes. He fights against demons. He has an axe. He's protective and healer and stuff. So St. Olaf is very much a sort of Christianized version of Thor. And in southern Scandinavia, he's often prayed to, or they pray for thunder basically to help the crops. Like I said, the lightning was believed to ripen the crops. So they pray to him basically around that sort of time, end of July sort of time, for storms so that it can help the crops. Tacitus says that before going to war, the ancient heathens would chant praise to Thor. Okay, and in Heimskringla, which is later on, it's not. So Tacitus is back sort of like 1st century AD or CE. Heimskringla is like 12th century, 13th century. Says something like a platform which he stands on when outside. There is no shortage of gold and silver on him. 4 loaves of bread are brought to him and meat as well. So this is talking about what's happening with this Thor statue. There's a platform which he stands on. Okay, it's outdoors. They put gold and silver on him, and then they bring him offerings of bread and of meat. Okay, so that should give you some ideas of things you can do to worship Thor. Okay. Okay, so that's Thor. Now let's talk about Odin or Woden. Okay, so Odin is the father of Balder and the father of Thor, and he's the husband of Frigg and the husband of Jord. Okay. Now, the name comes from an Old English wood, which means madness or furious. The Old Norse other, which means mind or sense, or song or poetry, or mad or furious again. And then if we go back further into the Germanic root, it comes from woda, means delirious or frenzied. Okay. And an, which means master of. So he's the master of madness, fury, ecstasy, inspiration, intoxication, poetry, the mind, song, all of that sort of stuff. Okay. He is the archetypal shamanic god. Okay. He is a god with power over the minds of men. And Adam of Bremen says of him, Woden, that is to say, frenzy, this ecstatic, inspired, mad state, maybe intoxicated state. Okay, that's what he is the god of, and that's where he originally comes from. That idea. So Roman writers and Snorri both say he is the chief of the gods. Okay, Snorri calls him the All-Father, and Snorri says he rules all things, and as mighty as the other gods are, they all serve him just as children serve their father. Okay, so that's Snorri, a Christian, writing 200 years after Christianization. That's what he's saying about Odin. Now, Matthias Nordvig, he's the guy who wrote the book A Satire for Beginners that we looked at in the very first module. He says, many see him as the All-Father, although this is a misunderstanding of his original nature. Snorri is responsible for having portrayed Odin as an All-Father in the Edda, essentially interpreting him as a heathen version of the Christian god. In Scandinavia, few see Odin as the All-Father, but to many American Asatrua, he is revered as just that. Okay, so again, we've even got, in modern days, people seeing the gods in different ways, okay, depending on where they're from. Scandinavia, he's really not the All-Father, whereas America, he is. And that's probably because of our cultural Christianization in America in particular, with many Protestants who have an All-Father God of Christianity, now having the Odin as their All-Father God instead. But archaeology doesn't suggest that he was the most popular, okay? He only seems to have been really popular among warbands, warriors, aristocracy, poets, and then also their chieftains and kings, okay? So he got to prominence because the people who wrote everything down were the aristocracy and the poets and the warriors. And so he becomes popular that way. But there isn't a lot of evidence that common people worshipped him very much. He doesn't really appear in the sagas, and no one is shown worshipping him in Landnámabók, which is the earliest Icelandic settlers, who were also warriors and elites at the time. Okay, so even here, warriors and elites in that time don't seem to have been worshipping very much. And pagan kings are never actually shown worshipping him in Heimskringla. Okay, they're usually shown as worshipping Thor. So Odin seems to have not been the very most important god early on, and then somehow becomes a more important god later on. That said, okay, there are certain things to be aware of. Firstly, the Romans back in the 1st century do mention that Mercury is worshipped most of all. That's probably, though, it's probably referring to a particular tribe. So maybe there were particular tribes of the Germanic peoples that did have him as their chief, whereas others had other gods their chief. Okay. He's claimed as an ancestor in many royal lineages. You can see that in a lot of the Anglo-Saxon lineages. Woden is the person they trace back to as their first ancestor. He is said in the lore to create the world with his brothers Vili and Ve, or Honir and Loder. Okay, and Vili and Ve and Woden would have all had the W sound at the beginning of their name, actually. So it was sort of a poetic thing as well, poetic license there. Wednesday is named after him. Okay, he is said to wear a dark blue hood and a cloak, a grey beard, and he carries a spear. And he's also said to have one eye. Okay, so this is because he gives up an eye to the well of Mimir in order to get some knowledge. Okay, and they say he walks the world, checking on people's hospitality. So it's important to be hospitable. His hall is called Valhall, okay, or Valhalla, okay, but the original is Valhall. Now, Woden is very much the wise one, okay. He is always seeking wisdom. He wanders the world looking for wisdom. He gives up his eye to the well of Mimir in order to get wisdom. And even he hangs himself on the world tree as a sacrifice in order to get the knowledge of the runes, okay. So he's always about getting wisdom and knowledge. He also learns Seidr from Freya. So again, he's trying to learn knowledge. He sits on this seat called Hileth Skudjalf, okay, and looks into the worlds. So he can see all over the worlds from there. And he also sends out these two ravens, Hugin and Munin, to go and get information from the world as well. He is called Hapta Snirtrir, the one who makes the gods wise, okay, because he learns all these skills and then tells the gods. He also teaches skills to people as well. So he teaches war skills, and he gives people the mead of poetry, which makes them wise in poems. He can appear in disguise. He often does this in the myths, in fact, and he asks people questions or he tells riddles and stories, okay? And if you want to see a record of some of his wise words, you can read a book called the Havamal, which is in the Poetic Edda, okay, which is said to be his words of wisdom to people. And the whole purpose of all of this wisdom seeking is ultimately to try and stave off Ragnarok, okay? The end of the world, the death of the gods, that sort of thing. So he's wise. He's also a shaman magician, okay? He's very much the epitome of that. His very name itself means sort of like, as we said, ecstasy and inspiration and the frenzy and madness and stuff. We see him practicing magic, okay? So he learns Seidr and practices that. He learns the runes and talks about different rune spells he knows, charms and Galdr. So charms and Galdr are spell songs that are sung in poetic verse. They're not, even though some modern heathens say this, they're not just chanting the runes, okay? Charms and Galdr are spell songs, okay? They're done in a particular poetic verse. And so he can do that, okay? So he talks about knowing these charms in the Havamal. He both wins the runes, learns knowledge of them, and uses that in magic and Seidr as well. He has two ravens, like I said, Hugin and Munin. He has two wolves as well, which are Geri and Freki. And he has an 8-legged horse called Sleipnir. Could these be seen as spirit helpers, like you get in other shamanic cultures? Possibly. Hugin and Munin seem to be aspects of mind, so sending out his mind. Sleipnir, a horse, he's using that horse to travel the world tree. In fact, he travels the worlds through the world tree, often to the world of the dead, okay? Just like many shamanic cultures do. He is a seer, so he does Seidr, which is about seeing things. He's got Hugin and Munin, who he sends forth, and he sits on Hlithskjalf seat to see into the world. Okay, so he's very much a seer, which is a shamanic role. He can shapeshift, okay, and he does shapeshift, and he also consults the dead. So he shapeshifts, for instance, into a snake and then into an eagle when he's trying to bring the mead of poetry back to Asgard. He goes often to dead Seidr practitioners in hell to consult them for knowledge. Sleipnir, his horse, now a horse is often the steed of a shaman, okay? And Yggdrasil literally means the steed of Ygr, the steed of the terrible one. So the world tree is his steed, his horse, okay? As I said, he's associated with the altered states of consciousness, just like a shaman is. Ecstasy, intoxication, possession, inspiration. These are all things that are associated with him and with his name, okay? And he has these near-death experiences, these sort of initiatory ritual deaths. Like he's hung on the world tree to acquire otherworldly knowledge. He doesn't drink or doesn't eat. He goes into what essentially could be a sort of a ritual death, an altered state of consciousness experience. Okay, so he's wise. He's very much a shaman or a magician. He's also a god of war. Okay, so one name he is called is the god of victory. He can determine the outcomes of battles. For instance, there's a myth where he gives victory to the Langobards. What happens is there's two people groups fighting each other, two tribes. There's his wife Frigg supports one group, which is the Langobards. He supports the other group, but then he goes to sleep. She twists him round. The first people he sees are the Langobards in the morning, and so Frigg tells him he has to give victory to them, and so he does. So he can determine the outcome of a battle. Adam of Bremen says he carries on war and imparts to men strength against his enemies. Okay, so he can give strength in war. His weapon is a spear, okay, which is a symbol of warriors. Okay, he is the patron of warriors and the warband. Okay, it's not Thor, it's not Tyr that's the patron of warriors, it's him. Okay, and he gives weapons and advice to heroes. For instance, he gives a sword to Sigmund. He calls the best warriors into his hall, Valhalla, okay, to help prepare for Ragnarok. So Valhalla is not the heathen heaven, as we've talked about before, okay? It's a hall that he runs where essentially it's just a big battle scene, okay? People who go there, he picks, well, no, some people die when they're in battle. Half are chosen by Freya, go to her hole. Okay, the other half are his. Okay, he gets left with the other half, and those ones are the ones he's going to use for the battle at Ragnarok. And what happens is they die, they get taken to the hall, and then they have to fight each other during the day to sort of learn and really hone their skills. And most of them end up dying during each day, and then they get brought back to life in the evening, and they can feast in the evening. And then the next day they get up and fight all over again and die. So it's this same thing, just on and on and on, every single day. So not particularly nice place to be, really. He's also called the Valfather, or the father of the slain. Okay. Now, berserkers, which is a special type of warband, they are particularly devoted to him as his warriors. Okay. And his main animals, as we've talked about, wolves and ravens, they're beasts of battle. So that again associates him with war. Okay. Now, he's not just a war god. Linked with his shamanic role is he's a god of the dead. Okay. So he's equated with Mercury by the Romans. Now, there's quite a lot of similarities between Mercury and Woden, but one of the biggest ones is that Mercury is a psychopomp. He's a traveler. He takes the souls of the dead from this world to the next. Okay, so this is a role that Woden or Odin plays. He has Valkyries who are acting under his command, and they act as psychopomps as well. So it might not be Woden himself that takes the person to the afterlife. It might be his Valkyries that do it. Okay. In Volsunga Saga, Odin appears to row a boat in which Sigmund's dead son is laid. Okay, so this is an example of him being a psychopomp. He leads what's called the Wild Hunt. Now, the Wild Hunt is a myth you find across Europe, particularly in the northern Europe. And what happens is it's like a whole big host of scary beings, led by, sometimes it's Odin, sometimes it's Frigg, sometimes it's Lady Holla, or other people like that. And it's often the souls of the dead, and they pick up the dead, or even sometimes the living, during their ride across the winter skies, and take them to the afterlife. So, and he's the leader of that. So again, this is a shamanic, psychopompic role. The earliest forms of Odin, he was probably a death god at that point, okay, a god of death, because of his influence with, or his association with shamanism and psychopomps and stuff like that. He often speaks with the dead to learn wisdom, and he knows spells, particularly to bring the dead to life. So you can find that in Havamal. It talks about spells that he knows to bring the dead back, basically. He's known as the god of the hanged. So not only does he hang himself on the world tree, but he often demanded human sacrifices, for instance, war spoils, people who got captured in war, to be hanged on a tree as a sacrifice to him. And according to the lore, he's also the one that decreed that the dead should be burned or cremated, okay, rather than buried. So we see the burial practices change over time in Scandinavia, and it says in the lore that it was him that decreed that people should be burned and cremated. Okay, so he's very much associated with the dead and as a god of the dead. But he's also a god of poetry and eloquence. So this comes back to his role to do with inspiration and intoxication and things like that. So he's a patron of poets, okay, and that's partly why he became so, or his stories and his lore survived so much, because the poets, he was their patron, and they wrote a lot about him in the lore, okay, and that's what survived for us. So he gives the mead of poetry to the poets, okay, said that the mead of poetry comes from him, basically, and a kenning for poetry itself. So another way of speaking about the word poetry is Odin's mead, okay. In the lore, he's the one who steals the mead of poetry and brings it back from, there's a woman in the mountain look after it, and he turns into an eagle and gulps it down, basically, flies it back to Asgard. brings it to Asgard, but also some drops fall then to the earth. Okay. Now, the poets are the ones who wrote the literature. Okay, so as I said, so that's why he appears in so much of the literature and why he's seen as quite a high up god. When we compare him with Mercury, Mercury was not just the traveler god, the god of magic, the that sort of god, the psychopomp. He's also the god of eloquence, of divination and communication. Okay, so this poetry and eloquence thing comes in there. He deals basically with all forms of communication and eloquence. Okay, and in the Old English rune poem, the rune Oz, okay, it means, this is the Anglo-Saxon word, way of saying it, Oz, it means mouth, or it means God or Woden. Okay, so it probably, that rune is Woden's rune or Odin's rune. Okay, but it also interestingly means mouth. Okay, which associates him with the mouth. In the Old English dialogue of Solomon and Saturn, it says, "Who invented letters? Mercurius the giant." Okay, so again, Mercury is him and Mercury are the same sort of being, basically, in the Roman eyes anyway. And so it's associating him with letters. And of course, obviously, he wins the knowledge of the runes when he hangs on the world tree. So, and he brings that knowledge to us. So that's the knowledge of language, of writing, of communication. Okay, so he's associated with those things. And he's associated with intoxication, okay, which again goes slightly along with this poetry, eloquence, shamanic frenzy, altered state of consciousness, etc. Okay, his name comes from Wold or Odver, okay, which is associated with altered states of consciousness, with the mind, that sort of thing. He lives only on wine, is what the lore says. Okay, so if you want to give an offering to Odin or Woden, wine is a good one to give him, including mead, which is honey wine. Okay, but obviously wine makes you intoxicated. He's the one who gives the mead of inspiration and poetry. Okay, so inspiration and poetry is associated with intoxication, and he's associated with that as well. And then there's a tale of the Swabi, the Germanic tribe, in the 600s, and they have this big vat of beer. Okay, this, which is good, they say is going to be an offering for Woden, okay, or Odin. So it's not just wine; it's also mead and beer and other alcohols. They're all good things to give Odin, and he's associated with them. Okay, he's associated with fruitfulness. Okay, so in Volsunga Saga, he brings help to a family to conceive, and he does this by giving them a special apple. Okay, so there's fertility and fruitfulness in there. Some place names derive from the word Odinsaker, okay, which is Odin's grain field. So again, harvest he's associated with. In the myths, he works as a harvester. So before he actually gets to go and get the mead of the poetry, he has to work as a harvester for a while for the owner. And so again, he's associated with the harvest there. He has names like Farmatir, which is cargo god. So he's a god of trade, like Mercury, again, like Mercury. He's also called Mercator and negotiator in Roman era Germanic inscriptions. And in later Germany, the harvest festivals were often to Wold. So that's sort of how Woden survived as the spirit of Wold in later Christian times. And there's a talk about like leaving the last sheaves for his horse. So that was a ritual, or there was rituals where Woad is praised and given offerings as well as part of the harvest celebrations. He's definitely a god of healing as well, probably through his magical stuff. So he's called on in lots of various charms for healing. And in Havamal, he says he knows healing charms. We have some examples of those. The 9 herbs charm in the Anglo-Saxons specifically names Woden. We have the second Merseburg charm, which is about a charm for healing a horse's broken bones. But you could also use that for lots of different healing spells. And so again, he's associated with healing there. He's called on as a healer in that, along with actually quite a lot of the different gods in that case. And he heals people in the lore. So Saxo says that he's the one who heals Sigurd, for instance. But he's not just all these positive things like fruitfulness and healing and stuff. He also has a dark side. So he often betrays those devoted to him, okay, and is known to break oaths. So if you're going to worship him and honor him, be careful about that, okay? He's not someone who's going to be morally good and always your friend type thing. He will betray you if he needs to. He's called Bolverker, the worker of evil, the deceiver, the terrible one. He tests his warriors a lot, and he expects a big price for his gifts. Okay, so if you want to build a relationship with him, you need to expect that. Beowulf mentions a spear-brandishing warrior who incites trouble, which may be a reference to Woden, okay, or Odin. Okay, so that's Odin and that's Thor. Okay, so now we're going to talk about Frigg. Okay, so Frigg is she is the wife of Woden. Okay, and her name basically comes from the Proto-Indo-European Priya, which means beloved. Okay, and the Old English version Freya means love, passion, embrace, or the sexual act. Okay, so she is associated with love and passion. Now, if we look at her association in the Romans associated her with the goddess of love and beauty called Venus. And the Anglo-Saxon Elfric calls her Venus, the foul goddess, whom men called Frigg. Her name is found in the word for Friday. It means basically Frigg's Day, okay, or Frigg's Day. She's not just Woden's wife, she's also the queen of Asgard, and she's the highest of the goddesses, along with Freya. Okay. She lives in Fensala, which means marsh halls. Okay, so she's got an association there with water and marshes. And she's quite cunning, as we saw when we talked about the Langobards, where she she turns Woden round, so he has to give victory to the tribe that she supports in the war, which is the Langobards. He's called Fjorgin's maid. She's called Fjorgin's maid. Now, Fjorgin is a masculine counterpart of Fjorgin or Earth. Okay, so Fjorgin may have been the original name for Earth. Okay. Now, maid can mean daughter, wife, or lover. So it could be Fjorgin's daughter, could be Fjorgin's wife, it could be Fjorgin's lover. Okay, so she's sort of associated with Earth there, basically. However, there is a different goddess, Jord, who is Earth. Alfric suggests she is the daughter of Jove, which is Thor. So it says the heathens worship her as their god's daughter. So is she actually the mother, or well, not the mother of Thor, because that's Jord, but is she the stepmother, I suppose, of Thor, or actually is Thor her father? Different people have said different things, so it probably depended on the particular tribe, okay, how they saw these things. You can see a lot of her roles also by looking at the roles women took in Germanic society. So H.R. Ellis Davison, she says, her essential function seems to be that of revered wife and mother, the consort of the high god and the queen of heaven. In her earlier Germanic form, Freya, she gave her name to Friday, the day of Venus, throughout the Germanic world. She is seen as the lady of love, marriage, and children. Okay, so as we said, her name means beloved and love, passion, embrace, the sexual act. Okay, the Old English noun Frigg itself means physical passion. Okay, and it was also used in Anglo-Saxon poems to signify a man's sexual love. The Icelandic lore does include references to Frigg sleeping with Odin's brothers. Okay, so she's seen as not just mother and family and lady of love, but also all sorts of sexual love, basically. Basically, in this case, Odin goes away for a long time. Frigg is the lady of sovereignty. Okay, so she's associated with the land, and whoever is married to her is the sovereign of that land. She embodies the lamb. So basically, the right to rule means that they have to be married to her. So Odin's brothers, because they were ruling, they would sleep with Frigg. Okay. Now, in Scandinavian lore, she seems more equated with married love actually than free love. This is because Freya is more the one that's associated with free love. So she's the dutiful wife who watches over the affairs of love, of marriage, and family. And because of that, because of her name's association with Friday, it's considered a lucky day for marriages in Germany. She's a mother figure. Okay. Egil Skallagrimsson calls all the gods Frigg's descendants. So you've got, in this case, Odin and Frigg at the top. This is again an example where you might find the pantheon actually, and then all the other children. Okay, but actually they're not all literally her children. In fact, the pantheon as the pantheon as Snorri created it does seem to have different. It's not all those two gods, Frigg and Woden, and then all the other gods underneath. It's some of these other gods have different fathers and mothers, and they're related in other ways, and they're not all just one big family. Okay, but she acts in the role of a mother to the gods. So, as a wise and caring mother, she's often associated also with childbirth. And in Volsunga Saga, she asks Odin to help a couple who want a child. In Oddrunnar Grotta, both Frigg and Freya are goddesses said to be invoked by women in labour. So if you want help in labour and childbirth and things like that, she's considered a good one to call on because of her interest in that sort of thing. Okay. But she's not just the lady of love. She's also a lady of the home and business. Okay, so Frigg seems to represent the typical lady of the household, who's responsible for the smooth running of the household. Okay, so that's what it was like back in the heathen times, the Viking times. There would be the lady of the household who's responsible for running everything. Okay, she looks after its resources, she supervises everyone, like the children, the slaves, and the workers. The home was also the place where all the production happened. So people produce what they need at home. And so if you look at this from a modern perspective, she's the sort of the CEO, the goddess of business and economics, and a very capable businesswoman. Okay, that's how she would be portrayed today. Okay, the goddess of the business CEO or businesswoman. She's also been associated with keys in modern times, which symbolize the right to manage a household's resources and control how the wealth is used. Okay, so essentially she's the one in control. Interestingly, Anglo-Saxon laws call their wife the Frühwif Lockbar, a free wife who bears locks. In modern days, you can talk about the passwords. Is she the goddess of passwords? Okay. Spinning was really important in ancient times. Okay, so the lady of the house, she would have been in charge of spinning. And in the lore, we don't find anything really that associates her with spinning, but she probably was associated with spinning. And part of the way we know that is that Orion's belt, which is the star constellation, is called Frigg's distaff. And a distaff is an item for spinning, basically. And there's also images of spinner depicted on migration age bracteates, which may well be her as well. In fact, many European goddesses of spinning, they punish lazy spinners. So Frau Holle, Perkta, St. Lucia, they're sort of seen as in charge of these things. And so it was the same with her as well. In modern times, she's also, because of her association with the household, she's also been seen as a goddess of the hearth. So in most Indo-European cultures, they have a goddess of the hearth. So you've got the Roman Vesta, the Greek Hestia, you've got Brigid in the Celtic, you've got Agni, which is actually a male god, but Agni in the Vedic, and so on. You've got important gods and goddesses of the hearth. Usually it's a goddess. But the one curious thing is we don't find that in the Norse. or the Scandinavian or the Germanic. So in the modern times, people have said, well, probably Frigg would be the lady who's the goddess of the hearth because we're associated with the home and with women. So they often, like the Anglo-Saxon heathens now, call her the Frigg Hearth Mother, Frigg the Hearth Mother. Okay, so if you want to honor a goddess of the hearth, you could honor Frigg as that. She's also a seeress and protector. Okay, so in Tacitus in the Germania, it talks about the Germanic people respecting women so much because they particularly were considered gifted with the gift of prophecy. Okay, so women in that time were, they were seen as having this gift of prophecy, and you get special people called seers or seeresses in particular, who are always women. The Prose Edda says that Frigg has the gift of prophecy. Okay, and prophecy and fate are often associated with weaving. Okay, so if she's associated with weaving and with prophecy, then that all sort of comes together nicely. And as we talked before about the idea of weird, the Norn, where we said that weird wove this for me was a thing that was said. So prophecy and fate and weaving, she's associated with this sort of stuff. You have kennings for battle, which talk about victory weaving and weaving of javelins and weaving of battle luck. So she's not just talking about prophecy and fate, but also what's happening in battle she can control. Churchmen often condemned the magic women do in their weaving. So that shows that women were doing magical things as part of their weaving. Seidr workers do a lot of prophecy, and they have these iron Seidr staffs. Now, we found these in the graves, okay, and they look very much like distaffs. So a long stick with the sort of 4 iron rings at the end, I suppose, is the easiest thing. It makes it look very much like a distaff, okay? And Seidr itself has a strong relationship with weaving, okay? So she is probably involved with Seidr in this way. Weaving is also associated with protection. So there's several tales of women weaving magic shirts of protection for their sons, okay? And there are weaving swords found in women's graves. So we can see here that the weaving is not just about prophecy, it's not just about battle, not just about Seidr, it's also about magical protection as well. Okay, and Frigg's role in that. And Frigg's usual role in the lore actually is as a protector. So either of her children, like Balder, or of her favourites, the Langobards. So the Langobards we've already talked about a couple of times. She's associated with protecting them, but also there's like her son Balder. When they found out that he was likely to die, she went around the whole earth and got every single being to agree to shed tears, apart from mistletoe. And that's what did it for Balder in the end. Okay. She's also associated with magic and healing. So she's one of the goddesses mentioned in the second Merseburg charm, okay, as one who chants to heal a horse. So she's very much associated with protection, seeresses, prophecy, healing, magic, that sort of stuff. Just like we found Thor was and Woden and Odin was. Now, there's a question now over whether Frigg and Freya are the same being, okay? They have lots of similarities, but they also have differences. So you'll need to come to your own conclusion on this, okay? They are both goddesses of love. They are both associated with magic and prophecy, like Seidr and things like that. They both sleep with Odin. They both grieve. So Frigg grieves for her son Balder, and Freya grieves for her husband Other, okay? Now, Other means mental excitement, ecstasy. Odin is the master of ecstasy, okay? So it could be that Other is the same as Odin. We don't know, but you can make that assumption. But be aware that men could have multiple wives, so it may not be the same. Both are accused of sexual promiscuousness. Both have falcon cloaks that they use to fly. This is according to Snorri, but actually no myths show that. Okay, this is just something that Snorri says. There is no Freya among the Anglo-Saxons, so perhaps aspects of both were bound up in one goddess. And Frigg is actually referred to as Freya, lady, in Anglo-Saxon sources. Okay, so that's where there's a lot of similarities between them. They could well be the same being or come from the same being, but their names actually evolve from different root words, okay, etymologically. Frigg's name is from the Proto-Indo-European Priya, which means beloved, while Freya's name is from the Proto-Indo-European Per or Pro, which means before or ahead of others, okay. Frigg seems to be much more associated with marriage and motherhood. Freya definitely is not, okay. They are clearly differentiated in the Scandinavian lore, and they have different family lineages, okay? So they do definitely seem within Scandinavia to be different goddesses, okay? And there are some similarities, and perhaps at certain times aspects of one influences the other, but it seems from the sources that they are differentiated early on, okay? So even if they were the same, it would have been very early on that they differentiated into two beings. All right, so you need to make up your mind on whether you think they're the same. And if you take a more Norse approach to heathenry, you're probably going to see them as different. If you take an Anglo-Saxon approach to heathenry, you may see them as the same being. Freya doesn't really appear in the Anglo-Saxons at all. Okay, and then there's another thing to be aware of, which is the handmaidens. Okay, so these are said to be the handmaidens of Frigg. Now, they could be separate goddesses. They may just be hypostases, like versions of Frigg, okay? You've got Saga, who remembers the ancient lore and the tales. You've got Eir, who is called the best of healers in Gylfaginning 35, and she's one of a group of different healing goddesses. You've got Gethjon, who is the giver, the lady of sovereignty, rivers and sea, the protector of young women, and the seeress. You've got Fulla, who is Frigg's sister, and mentioned in the second Merseburg charm. Her name means full, as in abundance, okay? And she carries Frigg's casket of jewels and guards Frigg's mysteries, okay? You've got Sjoffen, who means affection or friendship or love, particularly familial love, and she's a patroness of diplomacy. You've got Lotham, which brings couples together and helps when other family members try to interfere in relationships. You've got Var, who hears all oaths, avenges oaths that are broken, and oversees marriage contracts. You've got Vor, who is about a woman's intuition, and nothing can be hidden from her. Okay. You have Sin, one who wards the doors of the hall against those who shouldn't enter, and one who defends boundaries. Okay, so she's more protective. Hlyn also is protective, protects humans and Frigg's chosen ones from danger. So she's very much a protector there. Snotra is wise, courteous, self-controlled, and has lots of social skills. And Gna, who carries Frigg's messages throughout the worlds. So these may be completely separate beings. It may be, for instance, that these were goddesses from different tribes, and then somehow they get brought together, particularly by Snorri, as handmaidens of Frigg, or they could actually be parts of Frigg herself, or they might just be separate goddesses. Okay, so lots of options there, and these are some things you're going to need to think about and decide for yourself what you believe and how you feel, what the lore seems to suggest to you. Okay, so I'm going to finish the video here, and then we're going to go into the next video talking about some of the other gods.